Welcome you to the 32nd Annual Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide here at Vanier College. Before we start the presentation, we'd like to thank our honorary chair, Rabbi Yehuda Sarna, as well as our partners, the Holocaust Education and Genocide Prevention Foundation and the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. We also thank Rel Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and the Vanier College Teachers Association for the support. We give deep gratitude to the college for financial and logistical support, and especially to the Office of Faculty of Arts, Business and Social Science, the Communications Department, and the Director General's Office. Today's speaker is Barbara Perry, giving a talk entitled The Continuum of Hate. Barbara Perry is a professor in the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at Ontario Tech University, and the director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. She also holds a UNESCO Chair in Hate Studies. She has written extensively on social justice, hate crime, and right-wing extremism. Her publications include several books, such as Diversity, Crime, and Justice in Canada, In the Name of Hate, Understanding Hate Crimes, and Right-wing Extremism in Canada. Dr. Perry has made substantial contributions to the limited scholarship on hate crimes in Canada, including work on anti-Muslim violence, anti-Semitic hate crimes against 2S LGBTQI communities, the community impacts of hate crimes, and right-wing extremism in Canada. Dr. Perry is speaking live from Vanier College. Those participating through Zoom are automatically muted but can ask questions through the Q&A function. We ask that all attendees in the auditorium turn their phone ringers off and keep noise to a minimum so that all participants, including those on Zoom, can benefit from the talk. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Perry.
Thank you, and good morning still, I think. Good to be here in Montreal. I think we've gotten so used to being online that I think I'm speaking to a lot of screens today, but so nice to see people actually joining us in person. Always nice to have the capacity then for dialogue afterwards, what we call those hallway conversations. I was lucky enough to be here in time to actually watch the eclipse yesterday in Montreal, which is a good thing because it was cloudy back home, so I wouldn't have seen it. And so I found myself thinking that there I was in a dark space when on a regular basis, I'm working in and living in a very dark space. That is the hate studies. It's so much of the work that I do. Fortunately, the sun did come back. I like to think that someday we will move away from this darkness, work our way out of a job, in other words. Not going to happen anytime soon, I'm afraid, as I'll sort of end my presentation there. I wanted to take you through, as the title suggests, a continuum of hate. And that's not to say that this is one directional, right? And I'll talk about online hate, hate crime, and right-wing extremism, we automatically move from online hate to offline hate, and all the way up to extremism, but that there are relationships and connections between the multiple forms, multiple manifestations of hatred that I will talk about today. But I want to start by contextualizing that. I'm a sociologist by training, so I always like to think about the institutional, structural, ideological foundations of social problems that we confront on a regular basis. So I think that, this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but I think we can identify. It's actually interesting, goes in line with a lot of what Louis was talking about earlier today in talking about the vulnerabilities to radicalization. And a big part of that is what's happening in the broader environment. What is it about the context, the climate in which we're operating that enables hate? What I often say, what I often call lending a permission to hate. So we have a number of what I call flashpoints operating around us in the current context that I think make hatred more acceptable, make it more yeah, I guess acceptable to engage. It makes us more likely to engage in very similar hateful narratives that might have then more concrete implications in terms of violence and other forms of harm. So we are living, obviously, in turbulent times. We see the Trump effect, and I say 1.0 and 2.0, and maybe we're actually in 3.0 right now as we, the run up to the election. So that initial campaign and administration under Donald Trump in the U.S. really lit a fuse amongst haters and hate mongers in North America broadly, Canada and the U.S. alike, in that his vilification of a whole array of communities did lend that permission to hate, did signal, right, that these are people that are worthy of vilification. These are people that are worthy of our fear, our anxiety. And that's something that, of course, ramped up again after he lost the second election. Well, the election that was stolen, apparently, from his perspective and the MAGA followers as well. But even then, right, there were others to blame. Right, he was scapegoating people, and in particular, that he sort of moved away in that period of time from targeting culturally based ethnic communities, racialized communities, gender diverse communities, to really more targeting democracy, which is maybe even more dangerous and more damaging. But we're seeing now as he's running up to his now third election campaign that he is going back to some of those old motifs. He is going back to the racism, to the xenophobia, to the isolationism, right, that made so many communities vulnerable during that first administration. We saw how the U.S. insurrection, and we might add there, right, sort of the a year later, the Canadian corollary, the convoys, the so-called freedom convoys, how they both also contributed to different forms of hate. To some extent, it was targeting, there was some targeting of political opponents in particular in the U.S. insurrection, here targeting the state specifically. And so that's something that is, relatively new in the Canadian landscape, that what I call anti-statism or anti-authority incentive or narratives, the discourse that really challenges the legitimacy of the current order and demands that it be overturned, that it be reconstructed, recreated in a different image. So again, an ideological form of hatred directed not so much at those marginalized communities, but at the broader order. Protest movements like BLM and the indigenous resistance movement that were so vivid and so active, especially in 20 and 21, um, actually gave rise to considerable backlash violence as well. So you'll see that in some of the data that I'll share later on. In that, here were two communities in particular, and there were others, but these two communities in particular that were, trying to push their way out of the boxes into which they'd been placed, right? That they were challenging historical patterns of oppression and marginalization, in particular with the case of Black Lives Matter, violent oppression at the hands of law enforcement, and that wasn't okay with all people, right? That people began to push back, both in terms of narratives and in terms of violence. COVID and the convoys obviously created some context for hatred, especially if you remember the anti-Semitic and the anti-Asian narratives and violence that were so common during COVID, as those two communities in particular were scapegoated. Again, during COVID, we saw a lot of reaction against the state and the government, whether that was provincial or federal government in the Canadian context. So again, providing fodder for that anti-statism. Right now, of course, we're seeing considerable impacts at the local level associated with the ongoing Gaza conflict, and I'll talk about that in more detail later on. Again, a form of not necessarily it's not really backlash violence, but it is reacting to global conflicts, and I think that that's really important. That we often see that when there is a really impactful international trend, global trend, or global conflict or global event, that has consequences for folks here at home in Canada as well. And I think the last piece, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but the last piece I'll mention is the anti-trans, and I would say sort of the anti-queer activism and narratives that we've seen across the board as well, especially last year, yeah, 2023, where we were actually seeing protests at schools by anti-trans activists, challenging sort of the legitimacy, if you will, of the identity, but it's there to support school board trustees and school district trustees and others who are actually trying to roll back the rights of trans kids in school. And we've seen that sort of embedded in public policy as well, with legislation in at least 3 provinces across the country around the use of gendered pronouns and choices around gendered pronouns, lack of access or restricted access to therapy for youth in particular. So it's easing from rhetoric and narratives into concrete policies at the state level. So what we're seeing then, as I've indicated, is this normalization of hate, where it's become acceptable in the broader population, but almost de rigueur amongst political figures themselves in terms of the kinds of discourses and polarizing and polarized discourses that Louis was talking about earlier on, that also fan the flames, that also increase the likelihood that others will adopt, or if they've already held these views, feel freer to express them. And I mentioned the impact of Trump. We saw under Stephen Harper during the end of his last administration engaging in considerable anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant narratives. Right here in Quebec, Legault, I think this was on the eve of the second anniversary of the mosque murders, where he felt it was okay to say, I don't think there was Islamophobia in Quebec, so I don't see why there would be a day dedicated to Islamophobia on the eve of a night that was to commemorate and to remember what at that point in time was one of the most visible displays of Islamophobia. Then we had Sloan, who was a conservative, federal conservative, claimed that banning conversion therapy would legalize child abuse. So there he's playing into anti-gay narratives and homophobia and that stereotype of gay men in particular as pedophiles. So that if we eliminate or if we put a ban on conversion therapy, which is an attempt to cure the gay away, then that would release this whole legion of pedophiles on our children. And then I've also already mentioned the anti-trans policies. All of these normalize the vilification of the targeted communities. And that's had a trickle-down effect in the Canadian context, other contexts as well. But public opinion polling has been showing changing attitudes around issues that we thought we had sort of sorted in some respects, right? That we were inclusive, that we were equitable, that we were respectful of all comers, if you will. But we see here, and I think the first few are particularly interesting and go back to that notion of the normalization as people in public opinion polls express the notion that they recognize that it's become more acceptable to express negative attitudes, to express negative stereotypes, hurtful images, vilification of those targeted communities. So that's problematic enough. And then we come down when we look at immigration, and actually since 2019, these opinions, especially around immigration, have hardened even more so. So we've had some more recent polls around immigration that show increased numbers around these sorts of questions. And the one that's perhaps most problematic is the one at the bottom, where a large proportion feel that immigration is a threat to white Canadians. So that's right from the playbook of far-right extremists, white supremacist extremists, right, who argue that they're under threat. We're under threat by these hordes of immigrants coming to our shores. So very problematic attitudes there. So when we think about the harms of hate, and we often think about the immediate impact, especially with hate crime, sometimes with hate speech, the immediate impact on a victim, and that's dramatic, right? If we're talking about a hate-motivated assault, for example, the physical effects are often more dramatic if it's bias motivated. So when we look at anti-gay violence, for example, or anti-trans violence, it's horrific violence. Often, with implements, tools, things like tire irons and baseball bats, and individuals' identities are almost erased by the attack. So the physical impact is often more dramatic. And we also know that the psychological, emotional impacts associated with hate-motivated incidents are stronger and more long-lived. So the sense of anxiety that almost any victim of an assault, for example, might have is felt more deeply and for longer periods of time when the crime is motivated by hatred, because it's an attack on individual identity. Right? Not just, because of a bar fight or something like that, not something random. It's not at all random, right? You're targeted because of who you are. So there's harm to the greater harm to the individual. But there's also, hate crimes are often called message crimes for a very good reason, because they are intended to send a message to the broader community, right? You're not valued as a community. You're not welcome here. Right? You're a threat. I despise you. Okay. And it's meant to go to the broader community. So an individual might be chosen at random because they're representative of the community. Right? And that's especially the case, I think, when we talk about, and we'll talk about this a little bit more maybe when we look at the data, when you've got very public incidents like vandalism or graffiti. Right? Then the message is very clear. It's very obvious to the whole community. Anyone that can see it receives that message. But it goes beyond that. It also, the harm, obviously is to the victims community, but also to other similar communities. So if there's a rash of anti-Muslim violence, other marginalized communities might also be fearful. If you're Sikh, might we be next? If you're Jewish, might we be next? Okay, so it can spill out to other similar communities, other frequently targeted communities. And then finally, one of the things that we don't often talk about is what is the impact of hate crime on our shared national values? It reveals the cracks, if you will. It reveals the schisms in our culture and exacerbates those, right? Makes them worse and increases often that polarization, that distancing between communities. So, okay, now I'll get to the continuum, right? So I think one of the three issues that we're seeing most dramatically in recent years: online hate, hate crime, and right-wing extremism. All of these have just ballooned in the past maybe 10 years, maybe even less than that. So first, looking at online hate. Now, I talked about the harms of hate generally, and especially the harms of hate crime. And some of the harms of online hate are similar. Some of them are slightly distinct. So there is that harm done to the direct victims, right? If you're targeted as an individual, if you're targeted as a community, it is silencing, can be silencing. It's experienced as hostile. It's experienced as that message, right? That you don't belong, you're not part of the community. The flip side of that is the risk, the kind of risk that that Louis was talking about earlier on. That is that to the extent that that message is shared with others who might think the same way, it might have that potential to radicalize individuals. Right, to bring them, even if they didn't maybe initially share that perspective, it might bring them into the fold. It might harden those who already share those opinions because they're seeing affirmation from others. Right, we get into these little echo chambers, right, or echo chambers, eco or echo, ECO or ECHO. Isn't that funny? But we do get into these spaces where we're hearing the same messages, very similar messages again and again from multiple sources, and it might create or reinforce that attitude. The effect that it has in the values and culture of the online spaces. So online spaces have become hostile. Right? There's a lack of civility in online spaces, often in offline spaces as well, but in online spaces in particular, where it's as if gloves are off, right? There are no rules. It's especially where it's unmoderated or minimally moderated. If we look at the mainstream platforms, right, the content moderation is very weak and tepid. But let's think about some of those more extreme fringe places like Telegram or Gab, for example, which are unfiltered. There's no content. That was the idea, right? That there would be no content moderation there. So again, it recreates those negative narratives. But even in the mainstream spaces, right, there's a erosion of civil dialogue, right, of kindness, even in those spaces, and that has the effect. Then again, coming back to those echo chambers, right, recreates that polarization where you're not listening, you're not hearing, you're not listening to messages that don't jibe with your own attitudes. So what are the spaces of hate? You're probably all more familiar with them than I am even. I mean, there are multiple locations. We see both direct and indirect attacks. So we might get email messages that are directed specifically to us, broader messages in tweets, those sorts of things that are directed at us and towards us as individuals. So these are very directed attacks. And so we've seen a lot of that around women and people of color in politics, for example, who are, again, sort of seen to be stepping outside their space, right? That's not a place for you. That's men's work, right? That's not women's work. And so just incredibly hostile and sexualized and violent messages directed towards women in that space. And I think, directed towards individuals generally who step outside their appropriate boundaries. Sort of, what's the word? Malicious hacking, also often directed towards individuals, but more likely sort of groups or organizations that do the work in this space, the anti-hate work or the anti-extremism work, if you will. So one of the groups that I'm a part of is the International Network for Hate Studies, which has been a frequent target of hacking intended to disrupt our ability to share our messages, disrupt our ability to inform and to share resources with the broader community. So that's a fairly common practice as well. And then there are the indirect attacks, where it's not necessarily an individual or an individual organization that is under threat or that is somehow attacked or assailed, but in fact, a community that is attacked, that is vilified, right? So we see posts, whether it's on a website or whether it's in a social media platform, posts that share disinformation and misinformation about communities, about the likelihood of some communities to be engaged in different kinds of crimes. Excuse me. Or that accuse particular communities of being more likely to engage in violence or, as I said, particular kinds of crimes, or that represent other kinds of threats. That I mentioned earlier, right? That age-old stereotype of gay men as pedophiles. That's that sort of messaging. Where it again isn't directed at individuals, but is a contribution to the negative ecosystem, the negative environment that provides that permission to hate. So again, we see it on web pages, online forums, on social media forums, and the level of vitriol, the level of implied violence associated with them can be quite dramatic, and we'll see more of that in a very specific context in just a moment. And then I sort of mentioned in passing those sort of fringe platforms, and this is where we see the worst of the worst. And these are platforms, as I said, like Gab, like Telegram, that were constructed specifically to get around social content moderation, that were explicitly created to provide safe spaces, as they like to call it, for white supremacists, for misogynists, right? For haters and hate mongers, essentially. And so, though there are an array of platforms and pages and channels that are devoted explicitly to hatred against women, against the queer community, against racialized communities, against immigrants, against religious minorities, just goes on, and again, very often unregulated. But we still continue to see a great deal of those kinds of messages on mainstream social media platforms as well. A couple of years back, we did a little project on white power music. So white supremacist music in particular on YouTube. And I mean, some of the most vile videos and vile lyrics are still readily available on YouTube. Misogynistic lyrics, racist lyrics, homophobic, transphobic lyrics. With, not just, oh, I hate those people, or, they're evil, they're dangerous, they're threatening, but kill those people in the lyrics. So calls for violence, yet they're still up, right? Clearly not being moderated. And it goes on and on. I think maybe the last thing I'll mention here is the gaming environment. How many here? I suspect a lot of you are involved in online gaming in one way or another. But these have become really challenging, really dangerous spaces in terms of recruitment for the far right and other extremist groups as well. And it's not so much the games, although some of the games are horrific. So there's one called Ethnic Cleansing that's been around probably since the 90s, and it's still up and running. And as the name suggests, the rules of the game is to cleanse the ethnic community. So it is to, I mean, you get more points for killing racialized individuals, sometimes even for killing cops, right? That anti-statism, if you will. So the game itself is problematic, but where we're really seeing the dangers are in the ancillaries, right? In the chat rooms, where folks are coming in very explicitly to recruit, to draw people into deeper and deeper spaces, and coming in just engaging in a simple conversation, right? Developing a friendship, a relationship. Louis also talked about the importance of relationships. So bringing people in just by, starting a conversation, about, well, I noticed that you targeted this community or that community. Let's talk that stuff a little later down the road. So you have a girlfriend, you have a boyfriend. Tell me about that. Oh, you have problems finding a girlfriend? Oh, tell me more. And just draw them in, right? And slowly bring them in. It's a truism in this space that the process of radicalization is a slow one. It's not linear. There's stops and starts. And these folks are patient, and they will stay with an individual if they see a vulnerability. they will stay with this individual for weeks or months to draw them into their environment. So dramatic exposure to online hate for most of us, but especially for youth, as you see here, increasingly, and especially after, beginning with COVID and since then, and we've had a lot of conversations about that this morning, that we are locked in these online spaces. This is where we spend far too much of our time. And so there's more frequent exposure to these sorts of messages. And again, especially for youth, 80% of Canadian youth report seeing online hate, right? Sometimes directed towards them, sometimes directed towards others. That's a huge proportion, right? I wouldn't be surprised if it's, this is probably 2 or 3 year old data. If it's not 100% now, right? Because there is just that much of it in the online spaces. Looking at hate crime. So I think it was about 2 weeks ago now, the 2022 data on hate crime were released, and you can see this dramatic increase. Let me see if I get the right one. I did. This dramatic increase from, we'll even say 2016. There was a bit of a dip for 2018, but going up as well. Let's think back to what happened in 2016. Right? That was Trump's election in that very first year. And the US saw the same pattern. In that very first year of his administration, hate crime shot up dramatically here and in the US as well. So it shows the impact, I think, of that environment and that climate, that permission to hate, if you will. But just looking here, right, from 2019 to 2022, that's almost double. Right? The number of reported hate crimes, police reported hate crimes. If we'd seen an increase like that in any other category of crime, it would have been considered a national crisis. What's happening? Why are we seeing so many sexual assaults? Why are we seeing so many violent assaults? We're already seeing that in the context of car theft, right? It is a national crisis in terms of car thefts. I agree it is, but even that increase isn't as dramatic as the increase we're seeing here. Okay, so time for us to start paying attention, I think. We'll talk a little bit more about the distribution there, looking here especially at racially and religiously motivated hate crime. Racially motivated hate crime is the most common. Religiously motivated hate crime follows, and then hate crime around sexual orientation third after that. The most frequently targeted community in Canada, in most Western countries, in fact, is the Black community. So you can see here, year over year, that in fact, that's really cool. I like that. Yeah, we're seeing not just that it is the highest proportion or highest number, but also we're seeing dramatic increases in 2022. When we look at religiously motivated hate crime, we see that antisemitic hate crime is most common, followed by anti-Muslim violence. And I would add too that if we look over here again at especially South Asian and Arab and West Asian, some numbers there, but I think if we add that in with Muslim, because there's a tendency to conflate race and religion in the West. So, those brown people must all be Muslims. We don't have that ability to finely distinguish between communities. So I think that there is some overlap there in terms of race and religion as well. So yeah, you can see, I think, quite easily here the most targeted communities and where the increases emerge as well. Now, in terms of the types of offenses that we see, fortunately, they're in terms of physical harm, they're at the lower end of the spectrum. So general mischief you'll see here, and mischief, so vandalism, graffiti, those sorts of things. Although there are a fair number of uttering threats and common assault. Uttering threats can be terrifying to individuals, and this is what a lot of the targeted messaging, in particular online, but also offline towards female politicians is. It's uttering threats. Absolutely terrifying for the individual receiving them. But I don't think we should downplay the significance of these lower level incidents either, because they are so common. Right? There's something that people are aware of on a regular basis. But as I mentioned earlier on, they're also very public. Right? So it's a swastika on an overpass. Okay. Vandalism at a mosque, vandalism at a gay bar. So anyone who passes by sees that message, receives that message. Okay. So again, speaks to the broader community impacts of hate crime. It's not just an individual who's targeted there, it is the community as a whole. So I think very important to take them seriously. The last point I'll make, I think this is the last point I'll make about hate crime specifically, is that we're seeing those dramatic increases at a time when we're not seeing increases in crime generally. So if you look across the board here, very small increases in non-bias motivated categories of crime relative to bias motivated. So general mischief not increasing very much, but dramatically when it's hate motivated. Common assault actually decreasing in, this was 2021. Well, bias motivated incidents were increasing, et cetera, right? So much more dramatic. This is not part of a broader trend. This is a distinct pattern that we're seeing with respect to hate crime. Oh, sorry, it wasn't the last one. The important caveat here is that those data are just the bare tip of the iceberg, that there is so much unreported hate crime. There's a lot of unreported crime generally, but in terms of hate crime, something like 15, 20% of incidents are reported, and they tend to be the most serious ones, right? So while we're seeing over 3,000 incidents reported to police, that's a very small proportion of what's actually happening in the community. Okay, so important to keep in mind. And here's a good example of that, good illustration of that, right? These data here. So in 2019, which is the last general social survey, which is a national survey of attitudes, experiences around a whole array of social and relational issues, there were 223,000 incidents of hate crime. So people are asked a question, have you been a target of, and it's a very small category of crimes. If yes, do you think it was motivated by some element of your identity? So 223,000 incidents during that year. They were also asked, did you report it to police? 22% reported to police. So only 48,000 of those incidents were reported to police. But in that same year, police only recorded under 2,000 incidents. So even of those that were recorded, somehow we've lost 46,000 of those incidents. Where'd they go? Right? Why were they lost in the reporting? Which is the subject of another study that I'm on right now. So really dramatically underreported and underrecorded by law enforcement as well. And then on the other side here, this is broader justice processing beyond police. So we lose, it's sort of, we call it the attrition funnel. It's inverted, right? So you have all the incidents that occurred, all the incidents that were reported, all the incidents that were recorded by law enforcement, and then the disposition in terms of, what happens as it goes through the courts. So by the time we get to the bottom, there are very few court cases left. Very few cases make their way through the courts. Very few result in harsh sentencing, custodial sentences. So not very well, not very effectively processed through the justice system. And I thought it was important to talk specifically about what we're seeing now in terms of online and offline hate before I move into far-right extremism, because we are seeing a dramatic increase. So I talked about almost doubling of hate crime from 2019 to 2022. No doubt we will see another dramatic spike in 2023 data because of the after effects of October 7. So in those 2.5 months at the end of the year, we've already seen, and police have reported, a really dramatic spike in several different categories of hate crime. In the online space, what we're seeing here, a couple of studies I'll share with you. One was from Institute for Strategic Dialogue, one of our research project partners. who have documented dramatic increases in anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, excuse me, narratives and threats in the online space. The use of derogatory language, the use of racial and religious slurs had increased dramatically during that time. Another one, Global Project Against Hate, shows much the same. Again, and many of these were very early studies or analyses, still before the end of 2023. So the immediate impact of the attacks. And so you see here, same kinds of patterns, really dramatic increases. Offline, so we have social community-based organizations who are monitoring the hate crimes perpetrated against communities, again, both Muslim and Jewish communities. So we see here some American data. Again, within 2 weeks, we see these dramatic increases. National Council of Canadian Muslims, by October 19th, so just a couple of weeks, not even a couple of weeks afterwards, show an increase of 1,000% in incidents reported to them. And Jewish organizations as well, all showed dramatic spikes in anti-Semitic incidents. Police reported hate crime in Toronto. Hate crime tripled in the first 2 weeks. The end of 2023, this was data that was just released a while ago. 100% increase in anti-Semitic hate crime, 42% increase in hate crime generally, 100% increase in anti-Muslim hate crime just in Toronto, but other cities across the country have also shown very similar patterns, especially those like Ottawa, Montreal, that have fairly substantial Muslim and Jewish communities. So it's just some examples here to illustrate that. And again, you see this is across the board. Montreal, Toronto, New Brunswick, even London, Ontario. So some really derogatory language, some threatening language in those online spaces, all of which exacerbate the divisions, all of which exacerbate the fear and anxiety experienced by these communities already. And the far right, of course, is waded into the debate, but they're not taking sides necessarily. So you see here on the right-hand side, Canada First, previously Proud Boys, who sent essentially the same message, right, to two different, or sort of reflecting two different communities, right, and encouraging violence against both communities. And then we see Jeremy Mackenzie of the Convoy fame, Freedom Convoy fame, and of Diagolon, same kind of messaging, right? Get out of the way, let them kill one another off. Right? So not taking sides. It's a win-win for the far right, right? Because their two greatest enemies are both at risk here. Sadly funny, oddly funny, not funny, haha, but funny. Yeah. Yeah. So which brings us then to the last piece of the continuum, and that is the far right, right-wing extremism. We've seen such a dramatic spike in right-wing extremist activity, again, since 2016. It's just absolutely staggering. When we did our first study of the far right, which was published in 2015, we had a very small little typology here. There were probably, I think, maybe 5. Then we were identifying them as groups. So we talked about white supremacists, we talked about skinheads, we talked about neo-Nazis, and the anti-authority movement, which is already starting to wane at that period of time. Since that time, we've seen a dramatic diffusion, if you will, of the movement that has become much more diverse in its targeting, and often almost refined, so that there are, there are some groups, some individuals that might be primarily accelerationists, okay, but might integrate maybe some misogyny into their narratives as well. There are some that are primarily anti-Semitic, or some that are primarily anti-immigrant. Okay. But what's really interesting is that the groups are, slightly less important. I'll come back to talk about that. So we've switched away from talking about groups and talking more about what are the ideological threads that characterize the far right now. Okay. And so we see this great diversity of narratives and discourses associated with the far right. And I won't take the time to unpack them now, but if there's something that you're not clear about, you don't understand, I'm happy to come back to that during the Q&A. So just sort of keep those in mind if there's anything that that you're not sure of. So in our second study of the far right, which we concluded in 2021, I think it was, yes, so it says here. Again, thinking back to the first study, I think because it was the first one, we had a very long timeline. We looked from 1985 to 2015, and we identified, I think, something like 120 incidents associated with the far right, and included the same kinds of categories that we're seeing here: some violent, some not violent, some criminal, some not criminal. But here we see, I think this adds up to 668 incidents or something like that. So, and that's only in a 5-year period, not a 30-year period. So much more activity associated with the far right here. You'll see that the vast majority are in fact protests and rallies. And again, this overlaps with COVID. So a lot of them were involved in anti-authority, anti-medical establishment rallies in particular. But there was a lot of sort of overflow violence associated with them. And the protests and rallies, they're legal, typically. They were generally peaceful, but they're still dangerous spaces, right? Because they're on show, right? They're often followed by the media. So their messaging becomes amplified. Right? They look at the protests and the rallies sometimes as recruitment opportunities, right? For bringing more people into the fold by loudly proclaiming their messages. Okay, so they're not, I think, to be underestimated in terms of their impact. But we also see, if we look at the violence, 96% of the incidents were violent. Vandalism. I already talked about the significance of some of those lower level incidents and the impacts on communities. Threats and harassment, 61. Postering and promotion, again, that's recruitment. Long-term effects there. Hate symbols and hate speech, again, that message crime that we talked about, and some property crime as well. So some of these, I mean, things like hate symbols and hate speech, many of those might be what some have called awful but lawful. Right, that they maybe don't go over into that category, sort of legal category of hate speech, but are nonetheless damaging and harmful and dangerous to the communities. I think this really puts it in perspective, the risk associated with the far right in terms of the violence. So this is looking just at the multiple murders associated with some thread of far right narratives in Canada, just since 2014. Okay, so what's that up? I think it's 24. It adds up to. So we started with this incident in 2014. That was 3 RCMP officers who were killed by a far right activist who was also, anti-authority, anti-statist as well. Hence the targeting of sort of national police service. Then, of course, 2017 Quebec City murders, 6 people there. Anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim narratives in particular. And then 2018 in Toronto, that was the van attack. The individual who was shaped by incel or misogynistic narratives there. It's actually 10 were killed immediately. The 11th died about 18 months later of their injuries. So attributable to that attack. Then another anti-Muslim attack in 2021. And this might be one that perhaps you haven't heard so much about. It really hasn't been highly publicized. This isn't a mass murder. This was, we think, a serial murder. An individual who was part of a virulently and violently white supremacist group called Holy Europe, killed suspected to have killed at least 4 Indigenous women. So misogynistic, as well as racist motivation there. And they suspect that there might actually be more people. So 24 in mass or multiple murders associated with the far right. And then I think there were 3 additional individual murders as well. So a really dramatic threat to communities. Talk a little bit about just the online recruitment. And this is not to say that there's not a lot of offline recruitment still going on. As I said, the rallies are very often considered recruitment opportunities, engaging with friends and colleagues and perhaps classmates as well. One of the spaces we're looking at too is the nexus between the military and right-wing extremism. So colleagues within the military recruiting their peers. So we are seeing some of that face-to-face recruitment still ongoing, but that is certainly supplemented by online, online recruitment through that social media presence. That I was referring to earlier on, and those what they think of as safe spaces as well. Apps, white nationalist websites and forums. I mean, there are some of those. There's the Stormfront that has been up and running now for more than 30 years. It's not the largest, but it's certainly the longest lived. And what's interesting about it is that it's not just, posting horrific things about others and the enemy, but it's quite clever in that it has a women's page. And it's all about how to keep a household, of course, because it is, as well as being racist, misogynistic and paternalistic and patriarchal. So there are dating sites on Stormfront. That's a scary place to be. There are children's sites or forums on Stormfront. Okay, so it hits sort of all of the bases there. There are event sites, so just a whole array of forums there. The music I mentioned in terms of the white power videos and the white power music, which is a huge industry. One of the founders of one of the largest and most successful distribution networks for white power music was actually Canadian, and he's been out of the business of right-wing extremism for some time. But there were signs during COVID that he was actually coming back. But the music is very powerful in terms of drawing the community together, giving it a sense of solidarity. It's often what brings some people in because much of it is heavy metal. So metalheads will be drawn first to the music and the sound, and then start to understand the lyrics because they're not always very visible. And I won't do my head shaking, my head banging cry this time around. But it's also important to note that there are multiple genres of white power music. There is folk music that is white supremacist and anti-Semitic and Islamophobic and anti-immigrant. There's a lot of country and Western music. Probably after the heavy metal music, country and Western is most popular. And if you think about the legacy of country and Western music, I mean, it has historically been racist and misogynistic. So it's not a great leap, I think. So that's trying to draw in that NASCAR crowd, if you will. So the music has expanded as well. And I talked about the gaming already, how important that is to drawing people into the movement. The trends we're seeing, as I suggested earlier on, dramatic growth in the number of groups, that is new groups that were emerging after 2016, as well as new chapters of existing groups. But I think that we're beginning to see sort of a dwindling of that group base, what some people have called post-organizational organizing for the movement. So there's more emphasis on individuals and small cells acting in concert, all sort of shaped by the same ideologies that were in that typology, but not necessarily in that same group formation because it's harder to identify people who are acting individually. So I talk about them, you saw in the first on the typology, I think, lone actors. And when there's often a reference to lone actors. So all of those mass murders or multiple murderers were lone actors. What I like to call more sort of networked individuals, because they're not part of a group. They're not working in concert with other individuals. There's no conspiracy, but they're nonetheless very active, very often part of the online environment. Okay, so they're part of that community, they're part of that subculture, but not working with other individuals. They're not part of, they're not affiliated with a particular group. And we're seeing more and more of that, right? Unaffiliated engagement with the far right, consuming those narratives that they're finding, especially online, sometimes producing their own and feeding back, but not necessarily affiliating with individual groups. There's a demographic shift. Traditionally, the far right has been dominated by youth, 16 or 18 to about 24. Some might stay in later, especially if they have some leadership capacity, right? Because that's a sense of power for them. That's a sense of status for them. That part of their identity is so important. But we're seeing that supplemented now by, middle-aged and older people. If you look at the convoys, if you look at the U.S. insurrection, if you look at some of the, and you saw a lot of that here in Quebec, the border patrols, right? The far-right border patrols, when we were having so much irregular migration. These are not kids. These are not young adults. These are middle-aged and older people that we're seeing drawn into those narratives, drawn into the movement. They're often educated and well-employed, right? I have a postdoc right now working on the sort of class formation of the far right. And what he's been finding is that, yeah, there's, a lot of working class or even unemployed and underemployed people, but there are an awful lot of the petit bourgeoisie, right? The middle class, small business owners who are being drawn into the movement as well. So again, not those disenfranchised youth, right, who are angry because they can't get a job or because they don't have a place in society. These folks have a very secure place in society that they think is threatened. Comes back again to what Louis was saying about that perceived risk or that perceived loss of place. We're seeing more coalition building amongst the movement. In that first study, there was a lot of discord within groups, but also across groups as they were sort of jockeying for position and jockeying for the right to shape the far right narrative. But now we're seeing much more coalition building. And I think that was most evident during the convoys, where we had multiple groups working together, okay, during the Freedom Convoy. We had, Diagolon certainly came to the fore, but other groups as well from across the country coming together with a common cause, and that was to push back against the federal government in particular, and for those who were accelerationists like Diagolon, to overturn the prevailing order as well. And I think the last and perhaps most disconcerting trend is this nexus or this increased emphasis on arms and training. Right. So this is not it's sort of like American style guns rights narrative, which is not something that we've seen a lot of in the Canadian context. We're just starting to see some of that at the end of that 2015 study, but it's become much more prominent. Even folks like the Proud Boys, one of their little mottos says, "We love our guns." Okay? Very unusual in the Canadian context. You add that to the fact that there is an explicit effort to recruit people from the military, for even amongst some groups to encourage folks to at least join the reserve, if not the reg forces in the military, to get the experience, to get the leadership, to get the strategic arms knowledge and awareness that they can then bring back to the group to enhance their capacity to fight off the coming hordes. Right? So you've got arms, you've got the training and knowledge how to use them, and you add that to these noxious ideologies, these dangerous ideologies. I think that's a very dangerous combination. Excuse me. What's to come? More of the same, I'm afraid. I'm usually an optimist in life. I'm an optimist. In this space, I find no reason for optimism in our near future. We're seeing such a surge in far-right politics globally, not just in the United States, but in Canada as well, in Hungary, in Italy, in France, in the UK. Well, UK has always had its problems in that context. But there are so many successful and effective far-right parties and political administrations, right, across the globe, that it's further entrenching that normalization, that permission to hate, if you will. I think we continue to see little outbreaks again of COVID. Will that result in other kinds of restrictions that'll result in other forms of backlash? Don't know. The convoy inquiry and the related trials, they're just coming to fruition now. We're just seeing some of those trials roll out. So if we see guilty verdicts, excuse me, for some of the leaders, what will the reaction of the far right be there? I think that's something to watch. There's all this talk of, are we in a recession? Were we in a recession? Are we out of the recession? But nonetheless, there are widespread concerns, understandably, about affordability in housing, in groceries, the availability even of housing in some communities. And that has been used and will continue to be used to scapegoat immigrants, for example. Okay, it's because of them that we don't have more housing or affordable housing. So that's sort of can be a wedge issue for the far right. We've got the US election coming up. Trump's back on board. We have the Canadian election probably coming up in a year or so. We're already seeing polarization there, right? Are both of those trends going to give rise to a further emboldened far right? And I think our failure to regulate online hate, given how problematic that has been in terms of recruitment, in terms of a safe space for far-right organizing and dissemination of hateful narratives, I think that is going to continue to pose problems. How much time do I have? Okay. Okay. I'm just I'll do this, go through this really quickly, and there's countering hate. So individually, I mean, what this boils down to here in terms of how do you engage individually, not just collectively or at the structural level or the political level, but what can you do as individuals? And I think the two most important things here are informing yourself, educating yourself, being aware of what some of these wedge issues are, right? And trying to wade your way through the misinformation and disinformation to get to the foundation of those issues, whether it's about housing, right? It's the corporations, that's the developers that are at fault. It's not immigrants. It's not even, to some extent, and not only certainly a government problem. It's greedy developers. Let's acknowledge that for a change. So informing yourself, right? Educating yourself about the issue and being willing to have informed and civil dialogue around those issues as well. That's the thing we've lost, that ability to engage respectfully and civilly. So that's the bottom line here, I think, in terms of how do you engage this individually. Collectively, a whole array of things that obviously need to be done, and it has to start at the top in terms of political leadership and the willingness to not only call out hatred, but to act on that hatred when we see it. I keep saying, if I hear one more time, hate has no place in name the city. Well, clearly it does, because it's happening and it continues to happen. How are you going to ensure that it has no place in your community, in your country, in your province? Political leadership is sorely lacking in this space. And beyond that, I think what I would stress is, again, something that Louis was mentioning earlier on. The government likes to talk about a whole of government response to a social issue. And I would expand that and say what we need is a whole of society response. So these multi-sectoral partnerships are so very important to countering hate in all of its guises and all of its manifestations of, as I've talked about here. Excuse me. So it's not just a law enforcement issue, obviously. It's not just a regulatory issue. Yeah, sure, we haven't enforced the legislation we already have. How much better are we going to do with new legislation even? But it really does come down to every sector of society having a role to play there. And in particular, I put a lot of emphasis on civil society organizations, community-based organizations that are already doing a lot of this hard work. So if there's one important role for government that I would speak to, it is the need to support and fund the work that's already being done. Right. So we have so many good organizations doing incredible work on the ground. They might get funding for a year. They've developed a really successful intervention and their funding runs out and it's not renewed. How are we going to confront the problem if we don't have that continuity, that consistency? Right? So if there's one thing I would call on government to do, that is to fund those organizations in sustainable ways. And I think I will leave it there. You can see if there's questions about these other pieces, happy to answer those. But yeah, I'm much more interested in what you all have to say. Thank you very much.
So do we have any questions in the audience? Yeah. All right.
I would say doing your best, Phil Donahue, but no one in the room would understand who Phil Donahue was. So
I got it. I got it.
Hi, sorry. I'm just curious in your opinion, in places like the US where freedom of speech is protected, what could we possibly do about things like this, where we can't actively legislate against hate speech because it could be seen as a form of freedom of speech?
But we're not in the US.
Yeah, exactly. But because I'm a US citizen, so
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is a distinction. And it is a constitutional distinction as well. And that we have embedded the recognition that there are reasonable limits to free speech in a free and democratic society. And so I think the other piece to look at is that our courts have also tried to define what is hate, what constitutes hate, where is that line beyond which you're no longer protected. And so there's this fabulous Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case, Warman v. Cuba, which distilled all of those decisions and all of those definitions into what they call the 11 hallmarks of hate. And it is language that vilifies particular communities, language that, or expressions, because it can be images as well. Expressions that suggest that a community is without any redeeming features, that it's wholly evil, that it's wholly violent, language that encourages violence against communities. So it has been defined in Canadian law. And it's, for me, I think about it as dangerous speech that has real potential and often real implications for those targeted communities, that it does incite, and you'll see in the new online harms bill that there is an attempt to more clearly define it as vilification or detestation. So it's language that either expresses that or that encourages vilification or detestation of other communities. So I think we've made a very concerted effort to define what is hate speech and how it's distinct from free speech.
Are there any other questions while I'm here in this row? No?
Don't make her run down and back up again.
It's good. It's good exercise. No other questions up here. Okay, so I'll check the online. Yeah. Oh, you have. Hang on.
Wait for the mic.
Nobody's been up to the.
Okay, so do you think that nowadays, especially due to online influence, hate, not really hate crimes, but hate is more due to, following a certain trend instead of one's personal opinion?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think where does it start, right? And so it often will not start with hatred directed towards a particular community, but fear about your own identity and your own place in society. And so you will go in a direction, you'll go towards folks who have some explanation for why your life sucks, or that give you gives you some value and some place in society. And so you might not start with that, but you find yourself in these those echo chambers that I referred to, that give you messages that start to resonate, or you hear them frequently enough, right? That they start to make sense, or they become part of your belief system because of the consistency of that messaging. So I think there's a number of factors that come into play there.
Thanks, Barbara. I have a question related to policing and disinformation. So all these beautiful statistics that we've gathered, how much of it goes over to the police? So we're saying hate speech and hate crime are going up, and we don't necessarily see the policing, those kind of statistics in the policing aspect. So is there a connection with policing? Do they always or near always arrest people for hate speech and hate crime unless they're obviously violent? But will they arrest people for that?
Occasionally. Yeah. Gosh, there's so many things I can say here. First, the clearance rate on hate crimes is very low. And especially those at the lower level, right? Because if it's vandalism or graffiti, it's often under cover of darkness. You often can't identify a perpetrator. But even of those, so it goes back to that attrition funnel, even of those where you can identify an individual, often the hate motivation is not recorded because, oh, we've got an assault, we'll take the assault. So they're not going to worry about it because it's difficult to prove, right? The motivation. So you get that. I mean, even at first contact with law enforcement, because I do a lot of work with the targeted communities as well, and will say that they tried to report a hate crime and police talked them out of it. Okay, well, we might prosecute the assault or the vandalism if you can identify someone, but it was a prank. It wasn't hate motivated. They didn't really mean that, or the language came after rather than before the incident. So yeah, law enforcement will talk people out of it, and so won't record it themselves. They'll record the offense, but not the hate motivation, and that's assuming they have that much awareness, because I mean, most of our research is based on large services like Toronto or even like Montreal or Ottawa that have hate crime units. Most services actually don't have hate crime units or even an individual that's trained in that space. So they don't necessarily know it when they see it. And so don't often prosecute it, or don't often investigate it effectively. And then you get to the Crown, and the Crown will say, "Oh no, that's too challenging," especially with so we don't have standalone hate crime legislation. So if you commit an assault that is motivated by hate, you're not charged with a hate crime. You're charged with an assault, and the hate element will only come up at sentencing if you're found guilty, and the judge might decide to increase the sentence because it's motivated by hate. The other legislation we have is hate propaganda legislation, incitement to genocide, incitement to hatred, for example. And so those are very challenging cases. We've had fewer than 60 such cases go to the courts in the last dozen years. So very rare, because the Crown doesn't like them, Crown's afraid of them, and also has to go to the Attorney General of the province for permission to prosecute those crimes, and the Attorney General doesn't want to touch them. So they're very rare. It's every step of the system breaks down there.
Thank you. So we do have a question online, but I want to be mindful of the students' time. I'm aware that students often have a class and they need to get to their next class at 1. So so I think we'll say that it's okay for the students to leave. And if you're okay with me asking the last question from online, I do think it's interesting, but we'll manage with a bit of the noise in the background. Thank you all for being here. I hope you'll come back again at some point this week. And I'll go ahead and ask you that question, Barbara, about the, we're being asked by Liz online, who's saying about the radicalization trajectory for people engaged in the far right independently, these lone actors that you're talking about, or networked individuals. Do they eventually join groups? Is their radicalization trajectory the same as for those in groups? And does their independent involvement have the same impact on their lives as those who belong to groups?
I think it's so early in this process. It's hard to, I think, identify whether they'll gravitate towards groups. I mean, often there just aren't groups available for them to join now because they've dissolved. And so I think there's not much different about the trajectory to the radicalization, but I think it's just as problematic to the extent that it's still an important part of their online life in particular, in that they can, there's probably very regular engagement with others in that milieu who, aren't part of a group, but are certainly part of a subculture that they connect to on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think, David, we're okay for that to take another question. Great, thank you.
You were talking about the demographic change in these far right movements. How does that impact youth culture and like their rebellion or our rebellion in like all our alternative society and culture?
It's no longer cool. It's an old folks movement now. Yeah. Yeah. Well, as I say, it supplemented the youth element. It didn't replace them. There's still I would say it's probably still dominated by youth, but their parents have come to join them now, and sometimes their grandparents, as well as that. Yeah. So, but that's a really interesting question. Will it no longer, if we continue to see that, and if the leadership, is older, will it be as will it be as cool? Will it be as yeah. No signs of that happening, I don't think. Yeah, because what we're seeing, I mean, that's the irony. What we're seeing is that youth are becoming more conservative rather than more progressive. So yeah, that's disturbing. Yeah.
Very much. Oh, we have another
Very good
Well,
question.
so at this point, I think what we'll do is we'll end the online webinar and we'll just continue the chat here so that we have time for everybody to get where they need to be. Thank you very much, Barb.
Okay, thank you.